All right, welcome into a little bit of an emergency News for Jags podcast. Jamal St here alongside Justin Barney. So tonight was the NFL honors, and this is the moment where we found out this year's Pro Football Hall of Fame class. Fred Taylor, Jaguars legend, was a finalist, but didn't make the cut this year.
For the first time. So you've got to get there. You've got to have a starting point. Obviously, this was Fred's first year to be that finalist, to get over that semifinalist hump. I think he was a semifinalist 5 years in a row before he made the cut to a finalist. So this is a process, Jaguar fans. I know just from looking on social media and the upsetness about fans being upset, Fred did not get inducted tonight, but there's good news. There is good news. It's the start of a long process. We saw this with Tony Baselli.
Yep.
We've seen this with other guys who have had to come in and kind of pay their dues. And Fred will get there. Fred will get there.
Sure, yeah. Look, he's going to get in eventually. Once you're kind of a finalist, there's not a whole lot of going back. Almost every guy that becomes a finalist eventually gets into the Hall of Fame. It wasn't the first go-around. It's not the outcome that I think Jaguars fans definitely wanted to see, but look, there's next year. I know the wait has been long enough for Fred Taylor at this point, but we'll see. Look, that's the best we kind of got right now is we'll see. Once you're in the room, though, eventually he should be in the Hall.
Yeah, I think the NFL has put out statistics since 1970. If you've been a finalist, a Pro Football Hall of Fame finalist, the chances of you eventually gaining admittance hover in that 80 to 82% range. So pretty good. Once you're on that dance floor and those voting guys are hearing your story and your name, former Channel 4 sports director Sam Kavaris makes those pitches on Jaguars players. He eventually got Tony Baselli in. He will eventually get Fred Taylor in. I think it's just a matter of time. So I know Jaguars fans are frustrated and upset. Fred's credentials are pretty darn impressive. He's 17th all time in NFL history in rushing yardage. The only two guys ahead of him who are not in the Hall of Fame are Frank Gore, Adrian Peterson. You know why they're not in the Hall of Fame? Because they're not yet eligible.
Yep.
So that gives you some ideas that at some point Fred Taylor is going to be in that mix where he's in that final five and he gets that cut. His numbers are certainly there. He's kind of dinged for being not a perennial Pro Bowler, only made it one time. He played on a bad team. He had a bunch of injuries. But if you look at what Fred Taylor meant, I think you've got to look at the two in the era that he played. Had he not played in a rookie year when Randy Moss was absolutely demonizing people when he was with the Vikings, and that's Fred's rookie year, he would have been rookie of the year had Randy Moss not been in the conversation. But Fred Taylor's body of work is impressive. 11,695 rushing yards in his career, 66 rushing touchdowns, 8 touchdowns receiving, and as I mentioned, all the guys that are before him, the exception of 2, are in that Hall of Fame.
Look, this is simple. Fred Taylor should be a Hall of Famer. This is kind of ridiculous that Fred's not in the Hall of Fame. When you look at the books in the NFL, every player ahead of him with more rushing yards that is eligible to be in the Hall is in the Hall. Fred's not there. That make sense. And then when you start talking about his yards per carry, that 4.6 yards, and you say Jim Brown, Barry Sanders, that's the list. Oh, by the way, Fred Taylor's in there, so those are the 3 guys. It's a pretty good group. You'd think that Fred Taylor should be in the Hall of Fame. Those are Hall of Fame numbers. When I talked to Fred Taylor this season, when he found out he was a finalist, he said, look, it's easy. I sleep well at night because I think the tape speaks for itself. And he said that, he did what he was supposed to do as a player. He did the work, and the tape should speak for itself. And the tape does speak for itself. And this is coming from somebody who, I wasn't in Jacksonville when Fred Taylor was playing, but I knew who Fred Taylor was.
Oh, yeah.
And Fred Taylor was an elite running back then, and he wasn't just elite for 1 year. He wasn't just elite for 2 years. He was elite for an extended period. And I know, look, they throw out the All-Pros and the Pro Bowl numbers and stuff like that. But during that era, there were a lot of running backs that kind of just popped up. For a year or two, they were like those flame in, flame outs. And so they were the big AFC running backs of the year, the flavor of the week kind of, that maybe they had that huge season. Larry Johnson had one. Chris Johnson had a couple.
Yep.
And Fred was there the whole time. He just maybe was behind the 8 ball on some of those Pro Bowls because of these guys that had these, iconic kind of seasons, these short runs, though. Priest Holmes was a short-lived kind of guy in Kansas City that was in that same time frame that definitely took some Pro Bowl spots that could have gone to Fred Taylor otherwise. That doesn't mean he's not great.
Yeah, and you look at his career numbers, and again, he's not a Bijan Robinson kind of back. He's not a 5'10", 190 pound. He's not a Travis Etienne back. People who have not seen Fred up close in his prime would be stunned at how big, at how agile he was. I mean, this is a 230-pound guy
Yes.
who ran like a Bijan Robinson, who ran like, he could cut and change, and you saw the lower body injuries he had was from just that momentum and that ability to shift and jump cut and stuff. I mean, he was an unbelievable back in his prime, nearly 12,000 career rushing yards. He's got the numbers. Yes, I believe he's hurt from being in a small market.
Sure.
I believe he's hurt from, Tony Baselli took 6 years as a finalist to get in.
Right.
And the knock on Tony was similar to what the knock were on Fred. Now, Tony made multiple All-Pros, multiple Pro Bowls,
Yep.
was considered one of the best players in the entire 90s, and Fred was not in that chasm. Fred had a longer career than Tony had. Injuries kind of hurt Fred's prime during his prime years. He had a groin injury tear when they played the Titans right after 9/11, and you just saw how massive he was and how hurt he was and the ability to come back from that and have good season stuff. But Fred got that moniker where he was Fragile Freddy. I know it was unfair moniker. Injuries happen in the NFL.
Yes.
But Tony had the same thing. Tony had issues with injuries and longevity. He did not play that long, and that was portions of why Tony Baselli had such a difficult time making to the Hall of Fame. Now he's in the Hall of Fame. Kind of opened the door for Jacksonville. I do believe Fred is going to be the second Jaguars player to get in.
Has to be. Well, look, if it's not Fred, Jimmy hasn't gotten the respect that he deserves
Right.
either, but it seems like there's a whole lot of a bigger gap in getting
Right.
Jimmy in than there is getting Fred in. And then once you get past Fred and Jimmy, it's like, who would be next?
Those two, and then it'd be Keenan McCardle would be maybe that third one in line, but he's not quite there yet. Jimmy, Jimmy's stuff outside of football, I think, really, in a sense, almost look at him like a Terrell Owens kind of guy. Terrell wasn't a first ballot guy, even though his numbers.
No, it wasn't. It should have been.
It should have been a first
Right.
ballot. It's ridiculous, but I think you have guys, and Jimmy's issues were a little more pronounced legal wise. Had those issues, but no, the guy was transformative in what he did with the Jaguars. And again, NFL, he's a cast-off in Dallas, and he comes to Jacksonville, and he should be in the Hall of Fame. I do believe Jimmy will get a longer look once Fred is.
I feel like Jimmy's going to be one of those guys who gets in once he gets to the senior committee, where then Jimmy's finally, they're like, look, these consecutive 1,000-yard seasons, the things this guy did, the way he torched that 2000s Ravens defense, the only guy that really had success against them the whole season. This guy was good. I think once he can kind of get to that senior committee, it's going to take a long time, but I think he'll get in. I do think Fred gets in the next couple of years. I think he should already be in. I think he should have gotten in this year, but I do think there's still some time that Fred will get in. But I do still think, like, once you get past Fred and Jimmy, I know you mentioned Keenan McCardell. I don't know how close he really is. He does have some good numbers, had some good years, but after that, it's going to be a gap. Like these are the Jaguars players for the Hall, and then you start running into those guys that would have been coming in during those rough years.
Right.
Like
a lot of rough years.
Look, Maurice Jones-Drew, he was great. Mercedes Lewis was great, but they don't necessarily have those Hall of Fame numbers.
Right.
So,
and the problem when you get into this, Tony Baselli ran into the same thing. He was a first-time finalist in 2017.
Sure.
And, oh, by the way, who else is in that class? Terrell Davis,
Yeah.
LaDainian Tomlinson, Kurt Warner, first-time guys. In 2018, Ray Lewis, Terrell Owens, Randy Moss, 2019's Champ Bailey, Tony Gonzalez, Ed Reed. 2020, there was 20 inductees, but you got Troy Polamalu, Edgerrin James, Steve Hutchinson, who's a great guard. And then the 21 class, Calvin Johnson, Megatron himself, Peyton Manning, Charles Woodson. That was what held Tony up. And again, when you've got 3, maybe even 4 surefire things in that first year where you're eligible, it's going to take some time. And that's what this committee does in a sense. It kind of clears out the logjam.
Yeah.
But when you look at what's coming next in these 25 to 28 seasons, Fred's going to have some tough issues as well.
Well, that's why I thought this year might work, because it didn't feel like they had that many sure things on this year's ballot. That many guys where you looked at and just like, well, he's got to be in this time. It didn't feel like that. And so Fred coming up short is kind of a head scratcher. Yeah, there are going to be some stat cards coming up. All I know is this. If Frank Gore gets into the Hall of Fame before Fred Taylor, I'm gonna have a problem. I am going to have a complete meltdown. Look, nothing against Frank Gore. I was a Frank Gore fan, but that's longevity. That was not greatness. Like if Frank Gore gets in the Hall of Fame first, we riot. I'm just done.
University of Miami back product. He was a terror back in Coral Gables. Ranks number 3 all time on the NFL career.
That's
rushing
great. How
list.
many years did he play?
He may still be playing, for all we know.
Yeah,
Now, Frank Gore's biggest
Look,
contribution.
his son's about to come into the
That's-
league. His son is going through the draft process now, and Dad hasn't even been retired for 5. Dad's not even Hall of Fame eligible yet, and his son's about to go into
That's
the
crazy.
NFL.
Yeah, Frank Gore was, again, one of those backs of longevity for Frank Gore. I mean, he played forever. And, Frank Gore's biggest claim to fame in Jacksonville.
Getting Trevor Lawrence.
He helped Jacksonville get Trevor Lawrence. He had that rushing touchdown against the Jets and gave Jacksonville that number 1 draft pick.
That's right.
But some of these, looking ahead to some of these draft classes. So we talked about Tony Baselli having to kind of wait his turn. He wasn't a first ballot kind of guy, but this is what Fred Taylor is going to be up against in these next few years.
All right, who you got next year?
2025, you got Luke Kuechly, old Panther.
Luke Kuechly.
Kuechly. Okay, Luke Kuechly. Marshall Yanda, Ravens guard.
Okay,
sure
fair.
thing.
Sure.
Earl Thomas, old Seahawks
Okay.
thumper.
Sure.
Adam Vinatieri, he's probably a lock.
Yeah,
as a
Vinatieri's
kicker.
got to be a lock.
And Eli Manning next year.
Oh, that's a debate. We can talk about that. one.
2 Super Bowls.
We can talk about that one. What do the numbers say for
So
Eli
he
Manning?
may not be the first ballot, but he's a Manning. Those guys are
That's
football
the
royalty.
last name is going to carry Eli on this one. I know. Look, Eli is the debatable one because the Super Bowls are there. The numbers are kind of mesh, and like I just remember watching Eli and like who was watching the Giants and like, I'm scared Eli Manning's gonna like nobody was doing that. So okay, I get it. Eli had some good
Yep.
years, and Giants fans are gonna hate me for that, but it is what it is. All right, so Kuechly's definitely,
Yep.
even though he hung it up. Earl Thomas had some off the field stuff,
Right.
so if we want to talk about guys with off the field hurting them, that might hold him up a little bit. Marshall Yanda, yeah, probably.
Yep.
So there's a couple of guys. All right, what about 26?
26 is going to be even tougher. Larry
Okay.
Fitzgerald,
First ballot.
Drew Brees,
First ballot.
your boy Frank Gore, and Jason Witten. So
Jason Witten, okay, probably first ballot. there.
again, that's 3 tough guys right there.
Let me make it perfectly clear. If Frank Gore gets into the Hall of Fame before Fred Taylor, we riot. I'm done at that point. We need a whole new committee if that's the case.
And 27 is where it really kind of thickens up here.
All right.
At 27, Adrian Peterson.
Yeah, AP's
First
got
ballot.
AP is a first
Richard
ballot.
Sherman is in that conversation. Maybe
Okay.
not a first ballot guy. Gronkowski, first
Gronk's
ballot.
first ballot. No
Antonio
question.
Brown, he's going to fall into that Terrell Owens kind
That's
of
the
chasm.
off the field
And
stuff.
I do think Antonio is probably not a first ballot just from his off the field kind of stuff. Even those numbers are unbelievable. Eric Weddle, great safety. Jaguars actually made an offer to him years ago.
Sure.
I would have loved to have seen him in Jacksonville. Unbelievable safety, had a great career.
Mhm.
Alex Mack is another guy who Jacksonville tried to get. He ended up signing with the Falcons. Great center. And Ben Roethlisberger. So beyond
Big
that,
Ben's the first ballot.
so 2027, you may not even have. You may have hangover there of first ballot kind of guys who don't even get in. And then 2028, we got Tom Brady, J.J. Watt,
It's enough-
A.J.
enough
Green.
said.
Those are 3 guys right there, probably first ballot.
Those are enough said. So basically, what you're saying is next year's the year.
It's got to be 25. Or you're looking at 2029, I think.
Next year's the year for Fred is what it feels like. So I'm just going ahead. Look, Duval, just go ahead and make your reservations for Canton for next year. We were just a year too early on this. Look. Ultimately, I think we're in agreement that eventually Fred Taylor will
Yeah,
get in.
absolutely.
The question is, how long does the wait end up being? And the wait is the biggest problem. And part of this is that at least it's different now, because when Tony was going through it, it was like miserable. So the committee used to go to the Super Bowl site
Mhm.
city. They'd vote there. So all of the players that
Were
were
there.
finalists had to go and be in
Yeah.
their hotel room and hope that somebody came and they heard a knock on their door to find out
Yep.
that they're so for Tony, he had to keep going to this hotel
With his family.
this whole 9 yards, get your hopes up, and then there's nothing. So
Mhm.
now they've changed because the NFL is a business and they realize that those door knocks is good TV. So now the committee takes care of the vote a little bit earlier on, and that way they can send someone to the players' homes, knock on the door. They catch the whole thing on TV, make the nice special you'll see on NFL Network in a week or two, I'm sure. So at the very least, like Fred's wait now, much more palatable weight. Like,
Right.
you didn't have to make the trip and hang out in Vegas and just wait in your hotel. Like, can you imagine? Like, you played at a high level, you did everything right, you're just waiting to get in the Hall of Fame, hoping that you're going to get picked this year, and you got to sit in your hotel room and wait for somebody to knock on the door, and nobody comes. And you do that year after year after year. Like, that's hard.
Yeah.
Waiting at your house, I'm comfortable. This is where I
Yeah,
live. Like, I'll
and
take a nap.
Tony's talked about it when Mark Brunell was here. Of course, he talked about the
Right.
disappointment when you go to the Super Bowl expecting to hear that knock, 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 and you don't get it, and you get all your hopes up and everything. So I'm glad now it's not like that. Players know these votes beforehand before they show up to honors. So Fred
Right.
knew going into the honors he was not a Hall of Fame selection. But to me, it's more ethical in a sense where you're not asking these families and everybody to show up and only to be
Yes.
disappointed. So I do like that a little bit better than how it was. So again, but I think Fred is he's going to get it next year, or he's not going to get it until probably 2029. I think it's going to be a similar path to Tony Baselli faced.
All right, here's the question, though. So Fred Taylor's tape speaks for itself for sure. I think the tape is Hall of Fame worthy, even if it hasn't been good enough yet. So we've talked about the Jaguars in the past and how if the team got real good and made a Super Bowl run, all of a sudden that would help Tony Baselli, or that helped Fred Taylor. So like 2017, people thought that might help push Tony Baselli forward, or if this team made a Super Bowl run this year, that might help Fred Taylor. That didn't happen, but does the podcast. He does the pivot, which he's getting a whole lot. I mean, that is a huge podcast, a huge platform. Do you think that helps his case?
Absolutely.
That public visibility, keeping his name out there.
Absolutely. And I think the more you can do, the better. I mean, Tony was an on-air broadcaster for years. I think that putting that out there, just continuously out there. And people who never saw Fred, there's a lot of people who never saw Fred Taylor. There's not a lot of people who never saw Tony play. So I think hearing that, and having Anthony Munoz come out and talk about Tony Baselli, just people seeing that and reminiscing. Remember, a lot of these guys on the Hall of Fame voters block, these are older guys. These are guys who have been in the business. They're 50, 60, 70, 80 years old who have been voting forever. And, you're playing in a small market like Jacksonville, you may not be seen. And you got to bide your time and do that. But yeah, for a Fred Taylor whose numbers are, his numbers are good. His numbers are very Hall of Fame worthy. But you play in a small market in Jacksonville. Your Pro Bowl credentials are just not there. You never won a Super Bowl, never played in the Super Bowl. Yeah, I think it's great to get that footage back out and that conversation back out. That can only go to bolster Fred's case. And Fred, to me, he over the years it has shifted. I mean, Fred used to be very kind of anti. Hey, I was the best player in Jaguars history. I was I did this. He's become more. I not say mature, but I think wise in his age. I think he probably knows he's going to get in at some point. He saw what happened to Tony, but I do think Fred has softened up a little bit. Sure, it's going to be disappointing going home after watching the honors there tonight for Fred and saying, well, I didn't make it, but I think he eventually gets in. I think he knows that in his head now. I think he knows that he's going to get in at some point.
And I think like the frustrating part at this point is that he knows he's going to get in, knows he should be in, knows the numbers speak for themselves, and he has so many players that played against him that agree that, look, he was a Hall of Fame worthy running back, and that agree that he was one of the best they played against. And at some point, I think we got to start thinking about, do we need to redo this process? Do they need more player involvement on this process? Is there something that's missing here if there are so many players that agree? I mean, you had guys standing up for Tony Baselli saying, look, this dude's a Hall of Fame tackle. And these are guys that have the gold jacket, and yet it still took that long to get him in. And it's the same thing with Fred, where you got players that are standing up for him saying, look, this is a Hall of Fame running back. This dude was good. The size, the speed, the ability to stop on a dime and then restart at full tilt right after, the acceleration that takes. At some point, we got to start thinking, like, maybe we're missing something. Maybe there's something that's got to change.
I think when you cap the modern era finalists who can be enshrined to 5, I mean, you're up against that fulcrum of guys who are eligible for that first time coming in, and you're you see like the Tony class. I mean, I thought he would have been in the year before, but you that fulcrum of guys that are always coming in. If you always have that hard cap of can only put 5 guys in this year. Well, you're going to run into classes where you've got Tom Brady and J.J. Watt going in, and you're locked into those 2 or 3 right there off the bat. You look at the 27 class: Adrian Peterson, Gronk, Eric Weddle, Ben Roethlisberger, Alec Mack. I mean, those are 4 guys right there who were going in without even a question in that year. So, if Fred's case is heard in 27, well, I mean, you're up against Adrian Peterson. You're not winning that battle. I mean, you're up against Ben Roethlisberger, who's got a couple Super Bowls. You're not going to do that. So I think as long as you are hard, and it should be hard to get in. I mean, it should be an ultra exclusive club. But I think the only way to kind of counteract, do we have the right thing, is to say, hey, we've got to take this hard cap off. And maybe, some baseball years there have been no inductees.
Right. Baseball approaches it differently. And I do think that there can be years where there are no inductees, but where football has that cap, it makes sure that there are inductees to be had every year, because there are deserving guys like Fred Taylor who are still waiting their turn because they have that cap there. If you go the baseball route where you can have a 0 class because you've had big classes in the past where every guy who's worthy is almost definitely a first ballot Hall of Famer, then you start running into that. And I know the NFL will never never want that, because Canton, the Hall of Fame game, the Pro Football Hall of Fame, they want to keep that at the forefront of things and keep that moving along. I just wonder when you have guys, I mean, and Fred's not the only player that's got caught up in this that had the Hall of Fame resume, and for one reason or another, it took forever to get this guy in. He's just one of the ones that I don't feel like there's a whole lot of debate there. I mean, there are running backs in the Hall of Fame that don't have Fred's numbers. They just played in different markets, and that's the part that to me starts to question, do you need to have a change? Because when you start talking about some of these guys, oh, well, he got a Super Bowl ring with this team. Okay, and like, just because every player on a Super Bowl roster wasn't a Hall of Famer, that doesn't make you a Hall of Famer because you got a ring.
Well, it's kind of the Dan Marino argument, Jim Kelly argument. Those guys never won. That was always the ding on Dan Marino. Unbelievable quarterback.
Right.
Never won a Super Bowl. Never won a Super Bowl. Jim Kelly, the same thing. Unbelievable quarterback, never won a Super Bowl. How do you, should that keep a guy out of the Hall of Fame? I mean, for Dan Marino, it's not going to. But for other guys, there is kind of a hit to that where you're not that, blue chip like a Marino Kelly kind of guy, and you've never won a Super Bowl. And I mean, Fred is a guy like that. And he did not win a Super Bowl in Jacksonville. Finished his career in with the Patriots. And just did not have that success. Tony, for his brief period of time where he was unbelievable. I mean, he had playoff games against Bruce Smith. I mean, the game in '96, actually technically '97, but the '96 season where they made the playoffs. Tony goes up to Orchard Park and turns in this gem of a game against Bruce Smith, Defensive Player of the Year, stonewalls him. And that playoff game, big-time performance, Tony played unbelievable in playoff games. And, Fred just did not have that same success. So I don't think, not being in a Super Bowl, not winning a Super Bowl should keep a player out of the Hall of Fame.
Okay, so here's the question for you. We're almost done with this podcast, but this is the last thing I'm going to throw out there. All right, 99. They were that close. If they win that Super Bowl in '99, do you think Tony and Fred get in earlier?
Yes, absolutely. I think so. I think you go to the Super Bowl that year, you play the Rams, the greatest show on turf at the time. The Titans obviously got there. Kevin Dyson or somebody got tackled at like the 1 yard line.
Mike Jones Jr.
Yes, yep.
With the tackle. Yeah, so, I remember that game. Like, yeah.
And I don't, having covered that Jaguars team that year and been at that 99 AFC Championship game, I just remember being on the field afterwards and seeing Eddie George and how big Eddie George was. Sure. His legs, and he had a busted up foot, and I'm like, how is this guy going to play in the Super Bowl? His foot, like a grenade, blew up in his shoe. I mean, the guy was just such a big horse. But I remember saying, I don't think the Jaguars could go up and play the Rams and keep them. They were, the Rams were, that was peak Kurt Warner. Peak Rams right there. I mean, greatest show on turf. I mean, they were good.
Isaac, Bruce, Torrey Holt, another guy who's still trying to wait his turn. I
Yeah.
think Torrey Holt should be a Hall of Famer too eventually.
Yeah.
His numbers aren't quite as great, but he was the best receiver in the league for a
Former
short
Jaguar.
span there.
Former Jaguar.
That's right, right. Yeah. Should we ask him if he wants to go into the Hall of Fame as a Jaguar instead of a Ram?
That's right. That's
We'll
right.
work
One
on
big season in
We'll work
Jacksonville.
on
Same
that.
with Andre Rison was in Jacksonville for 1 year, former Falcon.
That's right.
But yeah, I think to your question, I do think had they cleared that hurdle, that's your second AFC Championship game appearance with Tony Baselli,
Yeah.
your first with Fred Taylor. I think they are no doubt they play in the Super Bowl. I do think that opens some eyes. I think Tony's in a little bit earlier.
Well, we'll see what happens for Fred, but this year was not the year, so the wait continues for Fred Taylor. We're in agreement. Fred's a Hall of Famer and will be one day. It just wasn't this year. I know there's a little bit of disappointment, plenty of disappointment to go around. We'll see just how long it is for Fred. Maybe next year. Maybe next year we can plan that trip to Canton. But I stand by what I said. If Frank Gore gets in first, we riot. We just redo the whole thing. I'm done with it. We'll make our own Hall of Fame. We'll move on. All right. Hey, thanks for hanging out with us on the News4JAGs podcast. We'll see you next time.